remember the first time I saw him. The sun was drowning in a red horizon, and the air carried that dry, metallic scent of dust and distance. He stood at the far end of the field, barefoot, his shirt torn at the shoulder, holding a small paper bird he had folded from an old newspaper. It was such a small thing, fragile, weightless, yet the way he looked at it made it seem like a living creature. For a second, he met my eyes. There was no fear there. Only the kind of stillness that makes you wonder if the world had ever been fair to him, or to any of us. That moment would follow me for years. Through cities and seasons, through the noise of modern life and the silence that follows loss, I didn't know then that this boy, this stranger from across the continent, would become the closest friend I'd ever have. Nor that our friendship would bloom in the soil of hardship, shaped by things neither of us could fully name. Because some bonds aren't born from joy, but from shared loneliness, from the quiet understanding that pain recognizes pain. If you've ever met someone who changed your life without meaning to, you already know the weight of what I'm about to tell you. But if you haven't, if you still believe that distance, language, or skin can separate the human heart, then stay with me. This isn't just a story about friendship. It's about survival. About how two boys from different worlds found a way to belong to something greater than themselves. Before we begin, if stories like this remind you of the quiet strength that still lives inside people, if they make you feel something real, then take a second to like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe. Not for numbers or fame, but because these stories deserve to live beyond a single voice. Now, let me take you back into where it all began. He arrived quietly, the way dusk enters a room, unnoticed at first, until you realize the light has changed. No one in town knew exactly when he came. Some said his family crossed the river at night, carrying nothing but a woven basket and a rolled-up mat. Others claimed they were refugees from somewhere too far south for anyone here to pronounce. To me, he was just a silhouette in the heat haze at the edge of the schoolyard, standing where the shadow of the water tank fell across the cracked concrete. He held that paper bird in his hand, turning it over and over, as if trying to teach it to fly. At first, I didn't speak to him. No one did. He was different, not in the way children can laugh about, but in the way that makes grown men lower their voices when they talk. His skin was darker, his clothes worn thin, his accent uncertain. The teachers called him Samuel, though the name sat strangely in their mouths, as if borrowed. Every morning he would sit at the back of the class, quiet, listening as if each word was a puzzle he had to rebuild in his head. And every afternoon when the bell rang, he would walk past the gates and vanish down the long dirt road that led toward the old missionary houses. I remember one afternoon when the wind picked up and lifted dust into the air like smoke. The sky had gone that bruised color it gets before rain, and everyone ran home. Everyone except him. I found him sitting beneath the tamarind tree, holding his paper bird, the wind tugging at its wings. I asked him why he didn't go. He looked at me and said softly, "I wait for wind to carry it." His voice was careful, shaped around each word like he was building something fragile. I didn't know what to say. There was something in the way he said it. Not hope exactly, but a kind of patience I'd never seen before. Days became weeks, and slowly, curiosity replaced distance. We began to share the same bench in class. He would draw small patterns on the corners of his notebooks, spirals, rivers, and faces made of lines. When I asked what they meant, he said they were from home. That word, home, lingered in the air like a story half told. He never spoke much about it, but once, when the teacher left the room, he whispered that his village was burned 2 years before. That his father never came back. He said it without tremor, like he had already spent all his tears long ago. Something shifted in me then. I had always thought loss was loud, something you could hear in a person's voice. But in him it was quiet. It lived in the spaces between words, in the way he stared at the horizon as if he could still see the smoke. I began walking with him after school, down the narrow path between the sugarcane fields. The air would hum with the sound of insects, and the ground would glow with heat long after sunset. He never said where we were going, and I never asked. Sometimes friendship begins not in conversation, but in shared silence. There was one evening when he stopped suddenly and pointed toward a distant hill. "There," he said. "That's where the wind goes." I laughed, thinking it was a joke, but he didn't smile. He said he used to climb hills like that back home to see where the sky touched the earth. "If I go high enough," he said, "I can hear my mother's voice." The way he said it, without a hint of fantasy, only belief, made my throat tighten. For the first time, I realized how far from home he really was, and how cruel it must feel to carry memories heavier than your own body. I began to notice how others treated him, the way some children mimicked his accent, the way grown men spat the word foreigner like a curse. He never fought back. He just lowered his head and kept walking. But one afternoon, when one of the older boys pushed him into the mud, I saw something in his eyes. Not anger, but a fire that burned behind restraint. I pulled him up and told him to hit back. He shook his head. "If I fight," he said, "I lose what my father taught me." I didn't understand then what kind of strength it took to walk away. I do now. It was after that day we began to talk about everything: dreams, death, what we wanted from the world. I told him I wanted to leave this place to find something bigger. He said everything big starts small, even rivers. He had a way of speaking that made simple words sound like scripture. Sometimes I wondered how a boy my age could speak like an old man who had seen centuries. But maybe pain teaches you the language of time faster than years do. One evening, as the sun sank low and the field turned gold, he handed me the paper bird. "Keep it," he said. "When you forget, remember this." I asked him what it was meant to remind me of. He looked toward the horizon and said, "That I was here." I didn't know why he said it then. I thought it was just a small gesture, a boy's way of saying thank you. I didn't know it would one day be all I had left of him. That night, I placed the paper bird on my windowsill. The wind stirred it, just enough to make it tremble. I remember lying awake, listening to the distant echo of drums from the village beyond the hills. Somewhere out there, the boy who had become my mirror was walking home through darkness. I didn't yet know how much that darkness would soon take from both of us. The next day, the wind didn't come. But change did, in a form neither of us could stop. The rains always came late in our town, and when they finally arrived, they came like vengeance. The first drops struck the earth with a hiss, the dust lifting like ghosts trying to escape. Within minutes, the roads turned to rivers, the rooftops to drums, and every conversation to whispers. It was as if the world had been holding its breath for months and had finally exhaled. For days we lived inside that sound, the rhythm of water against tin and clay, the smell of wet earth crawling through our windows. Everything felt slower, softer, and yet more fragile. It was during those rains that Samuel and I truly began to understand each other. School often closed when the storm grew too strong, and the teachers would tell us to go home early before the bridge flooded. But I didn't go home. Neither did he. We would sit under the awning of the old store, our knees drawn up, watching the rain carve rivers through the dirt road. I remember how he used to tilt his head slightly, listening to the rain as if it were speaking a language only he could hear. When I asked what he was thinking, he said, "Rain doesn't ask where it falls. It just falls," I didn't reply. Sometimes he said things that were too heavy for the moment, too full of truth to carry an answer. We started building things together, small boats from scraps of wood, bottle caps for sails, and thread for rigging. We'd place them on the flooded road, watching them drift until they disappeared into the ditch. It was a game, but also something more. Maybe we were trying to see if something small could survive the current. Maybe that's what we were doing too, in our own way. On one of those afternoons, his laughter broke through the rain. It was rare, that sound, unguarded, clear, unburdened. It startled me because I'd grown used to his silence. It made me realize how much of him lived beneath the surface, hidden behind politeness and restraint. We talked about music, about what we would do if we had money, about how the world must look from a plane. He told me he once saw one fly over his village and that his mother said it was a metal bird, carrying people who'd never seen hunger. "Do you think they ever look down and see us?" he asked. I told him I didn't know. But that night, I dreamt I was one of them, looking down from the clouds, seeing our small town disappear beneath the rain. Days passed into weeks, and the rain became part of our friendship's language. Every drop seemed to echo something unsaid. Forgiveness, maybe, or the slow healing of two boys who had both lost too much too young. He began teaching me words from his language, soft syllables that rolled like river stones. I could never pronounce them right, but he never corrected me harshly. Once he said, "In my language, your name means light." I didn't believe him, but the way he said it made me wish it were true. Not everyone approved of our closeness. There were whispers. There are always whispers in places too small to hold secrets. I'd hear them in the market, see the looks people gave when we walked side by side. "He'll bring trouble," someone muttered once, not quietly enough. When I told Samuel, he just smiled and said, "They're afraid of what they don't understand." I wanted to tell him I wasn't afraid of anything, but that would have been a lie. I was afraid, not of him, but of how easily the world could turn against someone so kind. One afternoon, as we sheltered beneath the awning again, he began to tell me about his father, about how he used to carve birds from wood and place them on the rooftops so they'd spin with the wind. He said they would carry prayers into the sky, Samuel whispered, tracing a pattern in the wet dust with his finger. When the soldiers came, he told me to hide. I did. But when I came out, the birds were gone. Maybe the wind took them. His voice broke on that last word, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, the rain grew heavier, drowning everything in its sound. I reached out and placed my hand over his. It was the first time I'd ever touched him. His skin was cold, but his grip was steady, as if he'd been waiting for someone to remind him he was still here. After that day, he began showing up at my house more often. My mother would give him food without question, though I could see the worry in her eyes. She told me once, "Be careful, my son. The world does not forgive kindness when it's given to the wrong person." I didn't know what she meant then. I only knew that the rain had made the walls between us thinner, and for once, I didn't want to hide behind them. One evening, when the rain finally stopped and the air smelled of wet soil and rust, Samuel stood outside my door holding a new paper bird, this one folded from a piece of my old notebook. He placed it in my hand and said, "This one doesn't wait for wind. It waits for time." I didn't understand, but I kept it anyway. He smiled, and for the first time I saw the boy he might have been before the world turned cruel. That night, I fell asleep listening to the quiet drip of water from the roof, the paper bird resting beside me. It was peace, fragile, temporary, but real. And like all things born in the calm between storms, it couldn't last. Because peace is not the end of a story like ours. It's only the silence before the fire. It began with the smell. Long before the flames reached us, the scent of burning found its way through the wind, dry, bitter, and impossible to ignore. The night was heavy, moonless, the kind that presses on your chest when you try to breathe. I was lying awake, listening to the quiet hum of crickets, when I saw the faint orange glow flicker against my window. At first, I thought it was lightning from a distant storm. Then the shouts began. The kind of shouts that don't carry words, only panic. I ran outside barefoot, the ground still slick from the last rain, and saw the horizon bleeding with fire. The old storage huts near the market were burning. Flames tore through them like something alive, devouring wood and cloth with a hunger that felt personal. People ran in every direction, buckets in hand, shouting names, throwing water that hissed uselessly against the heat. And through that chaos, one thought sliced through the noise. Samuel. His home was near the old missionary houses, not far from the flames. My legs were moving before my mind caught up. The closer I got, the louder the world became. Crackling wood, crying children, the roar of wind feeding the fire's breath. Sparks floated like angry stars. I saw him then, standing near the broken fence, his eyes wide, his arms wrapped around a smaller boy. His little brother, I realized later. His mother was shouting something from the doorway, her voice breaking apart with smoke. I reached him, grabbed his shoulder, and shouted for him to run. But he didn't move. His mother was still inside. The next few moments blurred into a rhythm of fear. He tried to rush back toward the burning house, and I pulled him back. He fought me, desperate, clawing at my arms. "She's still there!" he screamed, his voice raw, cracking. I told him it was too late, that no one could survive inside. But his eyes, God, his eyes, they looked at me like I was the fire myself, like I was the one taking her away. Then he tore from my grip and ran into the smoke. I remember chasing after him, but the heat was too much. The roof collapsed as I reached the doorway, a burst of flame forcing me back. I screamed his name again and again until my throat burned. The sound that came back wasn't his voice. It was the sound of the house giving in, the walls groaning as they fell. Someone pulled me away, an old man from the village, dragging me backward as I kicked against the earth. I must have fainted because when I opened my eyes, the fire was smaller, the crowd quieter, and the sky beginning to pale. They found her body at dawn. His mother. The air was heavy with the smell of wet ash and smoke. Samuel was sitting nearby, covered in soot, his brother asleep against his chest. His face was still, not crying, not even breathing hard, just still like something inside him had been burned out too. I knelt beside him, but he didn't look at me. For a long time, neither of us spoke. When the sun rose, it revealed what the fire had done. Homes turned to skeletons. The road blackened, the air thick with what was lost. Later, people began whispering about how the fire started, about how some said they saw strangers near the market earlier, about how those people always brought bad luck. By those people, they meant him. They meant his family. The word spread faster than the flames ever had. Blame is easy when grief is fresh and truth is inconvenient. I tried to defend him, but even my voice sounded small in that sea of anger. Someone threw a rock through the missionary house window that night. Another boy shouted, "Go back where you came from!" Samuel didn't answer. He just sat by the ashes, holding what remained of the paper birds, blackened shapes that crumbled at his touch. Days turned into a silence that stretched between us. I didn't know how to talk to him anymore. I wanted to tell him I was sorry, but sorry felt like a word too thin to carry what I meant. He came to school once more, sat in the back as he always did, then never came again. I went to his house the next day, but it was empty. The air inside smelled of burnt cloth and rain. His brother's drawings were still on the wall, smudged by smoke. On the table I found a small scrap of paper, half of a bird's wing, folded cleanly, unburned. I took it, not knowing why, only that it felt like something sacred. Weeks passed. The town repaired what it could, but the air never felt the same. People spoke less, laughed less. Sometimes I'd think I saw him in the distance, walking along the riverbank, his figure flickering in the evening light. But when I called his name, the sound vanished into the wind. Whether he heard me or not, I'll never know. The night of the fire became the night that divided everything, before and after, innocence and the ache that follows it. I learned then that loss doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it leaves you standing in the ruins of things you thought would last forever. But even as the ashes cooled, I could feel something else beginning to burn. Not in the houses, but in people's hearts. The quiet kind of hatred that hides behind sorrow. The kind that would not stop with one tragedy, and in that growing heat, our story was far from over. After the fire, silence became the language of the town. It hung in the air like a fog that refused to lift, settling in doorways and markets and churches, in the pauses between greetings that no longer sounded sincere. People spoke in glances now, in half-finished sentences. The school reopened, the streets were swept, the ashes buried beneath new soil, but nothing was the same. Every corner still smelled faintly of smoke. Every laugh, every prayer, carried a hesitation, as though joy itself had become suspicious. Samuel and his brother were gone for weeks. Some said they had moved north to relatives. Others claimed the missionaries had taken them away to some other village. But rumors are cruel things. They grow in places where truth is too painful to face. One morning, I found him back at the edge of the field where we'd first met. He was thinner, his eyes darker, as if sleep had abandoned him. He didn't smile, and I didn't expect him to. He only said, "They think we brought the fire." There was no question in his voice, only resignation. I wanted to tell him it wasn't true, that people just needed someone to blame. But he already knew. He said, "When you don't belong somewhere, even the wind sounds like an accusation." I didn't know what to say to that. I wanted to reach out, to tell him he still belonged here, with me at least. But the words dissolved on my tongue. Sometimes guilt is a wall you build around your own silence. At school, the air around him was heavy. Some teachers ignored him altogether. Others pretended too much, their kindness suddenly loud and forced. Children, emboldened by whispers they heard at home, began avoiding his bench, speaking to him only when necessary. One boy, Peter, whispered a name when Samuel passed. "Ash boy." The class laughed. I didn't. I should have said something, but I didn't. I remember the way Samuel's shoulders stiffened, the way his steps slowed just enough to feel the weight of that word. He didn't look back, but the silence he left behind felt like a wound. That night, I went to see him again. He was sitting outside the old church, the sky bruised purple and gold. The bell above us had cracked from the heat of the fire and no longer rang. It only groaned when the wind passed through it. "Do you hate them?" I asked. He looked at me, and for a long time he didn't answer. Then he said, "Hate is heavy. My father carried enough of it. I don't want to carry more." His voice trembled slightly, not with anger, but exhaustion. "But names," he added, "they're heavier than hate. You can put hate down. You can't put down what people call you." I didn't sleep that night. I thought about the names we use to divide, to simplify, to excuse cruelty. Foreigner, refugee, outsider. How easy it is to say them, how difficult to understand what they do. By morning, I decided I couldn't stay quiet anymore. So when Peter called him Ash Boy again, I stood up. The classroom froze. "Say it again," I told him. My voice was shaking, but I didn't care. He laughed, then shoved me, and we fought, clumsy, desperate, both of us swinging at ghosts heavier than our fists. The teacher broke it up, blood on my lip, bruises on his cheek. I was suspended for 3 days. Samuel said nothing, but when I saw him later, he gave a small nod, almost a smile, the kind that says you didn't have to, but you did anyway. After that, people began to look at me differently too. It's strange how quickly loyalty can turn into guilt by association. My mother warned me quietly, her eyes tired. "You're making it harder for yourself." I told her it was already hard enough. I think she wanted to argue, but instead she sighed, the way people sigh when they know they've lost something invisible. The rains didn't come that season. The ground cracked, the fields turned brittle, and tempers grew short. The fire had taken homes, but now the drought began taking hope. And in hopelessness, prejudice finds easy roots. One morning, someone painted words on the old church wall, "Go back home." Samuel didn't speak of it, but I saw the way his brother clung to him afterward, afraid to walk alone. I scraped the words off myself with a bucket of water until my hands blistered. But by the next morning, they were back, darker this time. I remember the day they decided to leave. He came to me after school, carrying only a small bundle tied in cloth. "They want us gone," he said simply. His tone wasn't bitter, just final. "The missionaries found a place for us across the border. I think it's time." I felt something close in my chest. I asked if he'd come back. He shrugged. "Maybe, if the wind remembers the way." Then he reached into his bundle and pulled out a small wooden carving. A bird, like the ones his father once made. He placed it in my hand. "You said you wanted to see the world," he whispered. "When you go, take this with you. Let it remind you where to look, up, not back." We stood there for a long time, saying nothing, because sometimes words only make parting harder. When he finally turned away, I wanted to call his name, to ask him to stay, but I couldn't. The weight of all the things I hadn't said before pressed too heavily on my tongue. I watched him walk down the same road where I'd first seen him years ago. Barefoot, quiet, the wind tugging at his shirt. His brother held his hand. The sun was setting behind them, and their shadows stretched long across the ground, merging until they looked like one. That night, I placed the wooden bird beside the paper one on my windowsill. The two stood there, side by side, one fragile, one solid, both belonging to a boy the world refused to keep. Outside, the air was still. Not even the wind dared move. I thought of what he'd said about names and how they follow us like ghosts. I wondered what names would follow me now, because when someone carries your story inside their silence, it changes who you are. And when they leave, that silence stays. Years pass quietly when you stop keeping count. The town changed, as all places do. New roads, new shops, new faces that didn't know the stories buried beneath their feet. The fire was rebuilt, the drought forgotten, and life, as it always insists, went on. I left not long after finishing school, carrying a small bag, a letter from my mother, and 2 birds. One of paper, one of wood, wrapped carefully in cloth. I didn't know exactly where I was going, only that staying would turn memory into suffocation. The bus drove past the fields where Samuel and I once raced the rain, past the church bell that no longer rang, and when the last familiar roof vanished behind the horizon, I felt something unnameable break inside me. Cities were louder than I had imagined. Everything shimmered and shouted, neon lights bleeding into puddles, voices climbing over one another, the hum of life too fast to feel. I worked where I could, studied when I was allowed, and learned to carry my past quietly, like a secret I wasn't sure anyone would understand. People asked where I was from, and I told them the name of my town, but not what it meant to me. Not who it held. I learned early that the world prefers simpler stories. Still, in moments of silence, in the hum of a train, in the hush before dawn, I would think of him. I'd wonder if he made it across the border safely, if his brother still followed him everywhere, if the world had been kind enough to let him begin again. Sometimes I would catch sight of a boy selling carvings at a market, or hear laughter through the rain, and something in me would twist. That small, cruel hope that maybe it was him. That maybe he'd turn, and the years would fold in on themselves, and we'd be those 2 boys again, untouched by all that came after. But hope, I've learned, is another name for remembering. One winter evening, I was walking home through the city when I heard a melody, soft, rhythmic, carried by a voice that sounded both foreign and familiar. A man was sitting by the roadside playing a wooden flute. The tune was one Samuel had once hummed when we built paper boats by the flooded road. I froze, every sound of the city fading behind that single note. The man was older, his hair streaked with gray, but the way he held the flute, the tilt of his head, it was him. It had to be. I called his name quietly at first, then louder. He stopped playing. His eyes met mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he smiled, slow, uncertain, but real. We didn't rush to each other. We didn't cry or embrace. We just sat together in the cold, sharing silence that felt like home. He told me he had lived in 3 countries since leaving, that his brother was now studying medicine, that their mother's grave was marked by a tree that bloomed every spring. "I thought you forgot me," he said, and I laughed, though my throat ached. "You're not easy to forget." He looked at me then, the same way he did years ago when the rain fell heavy on the tin roofs, as if the world outside didn't exist. We spent that night walking through the streets, talking about nothing and everything. He still spoke softly, still carried patience like armor. When I told him the town had forgotten him, he only shrugged. "They didn't forget," he said. "They just remembered what they wanted." He said it without bitterness, and I envied him for that. When we parted, he handed me something small, another paper bird, folded neatly from an old bus ticket. "This one," he said, "isn't meant to last. It's meant to fly. I watched him disappear into the crowd, the paper bird trembling in my hand, and I knew I would never see him again. But it didn't feel like loss this time. It felt like something finished the way a song finishes, lingering in the air, complete because it ended. I walked home, the city lights blurring through the fog, and placed that new bird beside the others on my shelf. 3 now, one burned at the edges, one carved from wood, one fragile as memory itself. Sometimes I still wake to the sound of rain against the roof. And for a second, I am back in that small town, beneath the awning of the old store, listening to him say that rain never asks where it falls. I understand now what he meant. The rain falls on all of us, the guilty and the good, the lost and the found. And it does not care for names or borders. It only knows how to fall. And in doing so, it cleans what it can, softens what it touches, and disappears quietly into the earth. When people ask about my closest friend, I tell them he was a boy from Africa who once taught me how to listen to the wind. I tell them he showed me that strength isn't in fighting the fire, but in walking through it and still choosing kindness afterward. I tell them that we met as strangers, but parted as something more than brothers, as proof that humanity, when stripped of everything else, still recognizes itself, and when they ask if I ever saw him again, I smile and say, every time it rains, because he is there, in the scent of wet earth, in the whisper of leaves, in the quiet moments between thunder and silence. He is there in the small paper bird that still sits on my windowsill, trembling gently whenever the wind passes by. And sometimes, when the world feels too heavy, I unfold it carefully, hold it to the light, and remember the boy who once waited for the wind to carry it, and did.